Model of reality: how humans construct a picture of the world. Chapter 1. We do not perceive the world directly. Reality and its internal representation. A human exists within physical reality, but does not receive it in its entirety. Instead, the human receives signals that arise from the interaction between the organism and its environment. Light acts upon the eyes, sound vibrations upon the auditory system, while temperature and pressure act upon receptors throughout the body. The nervous system then processes these signals and constructs an internal representation of what is happening. It is therefore useful to distinguish between reality itself and its representation within the organism. When a person sees a tree, they do not directly receive the tree itself. They receive a particular set of signals and construct a representation from them, an object of a certain size, color, and shape located at a certain distance. This representation works well enough for interacting with the world, but it is not the world itself. Why the brain works with signals about the world rather than the world itself. The organism is physically incapable of processing everything that happens around it. Of the enormous number of processes occurring in the environment, the nervous system receives only a limited range of signals accessible to it. Humans do not perceive ultraviolet radiation as a separate visual range, cannot hear most sound frequencies, and do not sense every physical interaction taking place around them. The brain therefore works with the information available to its sensory systems. Moreover, this information has already undergone processing. The organism selects certain signals, ignores others, compares them with previous experience, and interprets them in relation to its current state. This produces an important sequence: environment, signals, nervous system, processing, internal representation. Humans interact with reality through this system of intermediaries. Perception as the construction of a working version of reality. Perception is not a simple recording of the surrounding world. The organism must constantly determine what is happening, which signals are important, and what might happen next. To do this, current information is compared with accumulated experience. If a person sees a familiar object from a distance, they do not need to examine every detail of it to infer what is in front of them. Previous experience allows the brain to rapidly construct a working version of what is happening. This is why perception can be understood as the construction of a model of the current situation. This model does not have to be perfectly accurate. It only needs to be accurate enough to support behavior. What matters to the organism is not obtaining a perfect copy of the world, but determining what is happening, what it means for the organism, what may happen next, how to respond. In this sense, perception is the first level of modeling reality. A person first constructs a working representation of what is happening and only then acts within that representation. Chapter 2. Context determines what we see. One object, different questions. The same object can be viewed in completely different ways depending on the question we ask. A car can be studied as a physical system, a technical structure, a commercial product, a means of transportation, or a source of impact on the environment. The car itself does not change. What changes is the observer's task. A physicist looks for one set of patterns, an engineer for another, and an economist for a third. Each receives information about the same object, but selects different properties from that information. Therefore, the difference between descriptions of reality often begins not with different facts, but with different questions about the same object. What becomes important depends on the task. A person is physically incapable of simultaneously taking into account every property of an object in the surrounding environment. If we are crossing a road, we are interested in the speed of the cars, the distance to them, and the state of the traffic light. The color or make of a car may be completely irrelevant. If we are choosing a car to buy, the situation changes. Now price, fuel consumption, reliability, appearance, and other characteristics become important. Context acts as a filter. It determines which information the organism identifies as significant and which information it leaves unattended. Therefore, we can say context determines not what exists, but what becomes important to the observer. How context changes the interpretation of the same event. The same event can receive different explanations in different contexts. A person arrives late for work. An employer may view this as a disciplinary violation. The person themselves may see it as the result of a traffic jam. A transportation analyst may see it as a consequence of an overloaded road system. A psychologist may consider it a possible consequence of the person's behavioral patterns. Each interpretation highlights certain causes while leaving others outside the field of attention. Therefore, context does not simply determine what we notice. It also influences what explanation we construct from what we notice. This is important when choosing a model of reality. Before asking which model is better, we first need to understand what question we are asking and for what purpose we are examining reality. Chapter 3. Experience shapes the space of possibility. The past becomes the basis for future predictions. Humans constantly use past experience to evaluate the future. When we encounter a new situation, the brain compares it with what is already known. Based on previous events, expectations are formed. What is likely to happen, how other people may behave, and what consequences our actions may produce. Therefore, experience is not simply an archive of memories. It becomes the material from which predictions about the future are constructed. A person who has encountered a particular pattern several times begins to expect it to occur again. If that expectation is confirmed, the corresponding behavioral model becomes reinforced. This produces the following sequence: past experience, model, prediction of the future, action. Why the unknown is difficult to imagine. It is easy for a person to imagine a new combination of familiar elements, but much more difficult to construct a representation of something for which they have no suitable images or patterns. We can imagine an unfamiliar city by combining familiar buildings, roads, and streets. We can imagine an unfamiliar technology by combining principles that we already know. But when a phenomenon is fundamentally unlike anything we have encountered before, it becomes significantly more difficult even to formulate it correctly. Therefore, the absence of a representation of something does not mean that the phenomenon itself does not exist. The statement, "I cannot imagine how this could be possible," describes a limitation of our model, not necessarily a limitation of reality. A person cannot move beyond their available information through willpower alone. A person can consciously decide to think differently, but intention alone is not enough to create a new model. To expand the space of possibilities, new information, new experience, or interaction with other models is required. This is why education, research, experimentation, and interaction with people who have different experiences can expand a person's understanding of the world. New information becomes the material for new models. However, this does not mean that a person is completely confined by past experience. They are capable of combining existing knowledge, generating hypotheses, and testing things they have never observed before. Therefore, the boundaries of experience are not a rigid boundary of what is possible, but rather the boundary of what we are currently able to confidently imagine and predict. Chapter 4. How a model of the world emerges. Fact, interpretation, and causality. A person receives information about what is happening, but a fact by itself is not yet an explanation. Fact: the person arrived late for work. Interpretation: they are irresponsible. Causality: they arrived late because they do not take their work responsibilities seriously enough. At each successive level, an additional assumption is introduced. The problem begins when an interpretation is perceived as a fact, and a presumed cause is treated as an established pattern. Therefore, when analyzing any situation, it is useful to distinguish between what is directly known, how it is interpreted, what cause is presumed, what prediction follows from it. This makes it possible to see where observation ends and the model begins. A model as a simplification of reality. Reality is too complex for a person to take into account all of its existing relationships simultaneously. A model therefore selects only part of the available information. For example, an economic model may view a person as a participant in exchange and take into account income, price, and incentives. A psychological model may focus on experience, motivation, and perception. A biological model may focus on the state of the organism, the nervous system, and interaction with the environment. None of these models is required to describe a person completely. A model is useful precisely because it simplifies a complex system into a set of factors that can be worked with. Therefore, the question is not whether a model is complete. It cannot be complete. The real question is, does it identify the relationships necessary for the task well enough? When a model begins to be perceived as reality itself, as long as a person understands that they are using a model, they can compare it with other models and test it against results. The problem arises when the model ceases to be perceived as a model. Its categories then begin to appear as natural properties of the world itself. The person stops thinking, I am looking at this through a particular explanatory framework, and begins to think, this is simply how the world works. This is how a working model becomes a worldview that is no longer tested but defended. This happens especially easily with models that a person acquires during childhood, through education and culture, or uses constantly in everyday life. Therefore, an important intellectual habit is the ability to periodically ask, am I observing reality right now, or am I looking at it through a particular model? This simple distinction makes it possible to preserve the ability to change one's understanding of the world when the results begin to contradict it. Chapter 5. We live within other people's models. Why it is impossible to independently verify the entire world. A person receives an enormous amount of information about events they cannot personally observe. We cannot independently verify most historical events, scientific discoveries, economic processes, political decisions, or technical data. Therefore, we have to rely on information obtained from other people and organizations. This is not a deficiency of the individual. It is a fundamental condition of living in a complex society. Modern civilization itself is built on the division of knowledge. One person conducts an experiment, another analyzes the results, a third develops a technology, and a fourth uses it without knowing all the details of how it works. The problem does not lie in trust itself, but in the fact that along with information, we often accept someone else's interpretation of that information. Language, culture, education, and institutions as carriers of models. Models of reality are transmitted through language, education, culture, and scientific and social institutions. When a child learns that a particular event occurred for a particular reason, they receive not only information about the event, they also receive an already established connection between the event and its explanation. The same happens with historical narratives, political ideas, religious beliefs, economic concepts, and ideas about normal behavior. Language is especially important because words themselves already divide reality into categories. To call a person a competitor, partner, threat, or customer is to view that person within different contexts. Therefore, culture transmits more than knowledge about the world. It transmits ways of classifying and interpreting it. How someone else's explanation becomes our own belief. Initially, a person may perceive a particular explanation simply as information received from someone else. But if it is repeated many times, confirmed by the people around them, and used to explain new events, it gradually becomes part of their own model of the world. At some point, the person no longer remembers where this representation came from. They simply perceive it as obvious. This is how someone else's model becomes one's own. Beliefs that allow a person to quickly explain many different events become especially persistent. The more often a model successfully works, the more natural it appears. Therefore, it is sometimes useful to distinguish between, I know this from my own observation, and I was told that this is how it is. Even more importantly, we can ask, if this explanation is a model, what facts could show that it is wrong? It is precisely this question that restores a person's ability to test even those representations that have long become part of their worldview. Chapter 6. The model controls behavior. The model creates a prediction. A person acts not only on the basis of what is happening now, but also on the basis of what they believe will happen next. If a person believes that a particular action will lead to a desired outcome, the probability of taking that action increases. Therefore, between the perception of a situation and behavior, there is an intermediate level, prediction. In simplified form, the sequence looks like this: situation, model, prediction, action. For example, a person believes that a particular job will bring them more money and improve their quality of life. This representation of the future becomes the basis for deciding to accept the job. The model essentially answers the question, what is most likely to happen if I do this? The prediction determines the decision. A person rarely has complete information about the consequences of their actions. Therefore, decisions are made on the basis of an anticipated future. If the expected benefit appears high, the action becomes more attractive. If a loss, danger, or lack of results is expected, the person is more likely to avoid it. At the same time, the prediction itself may be wrong. A person may overestimate the probability of success, underestimate the risk, or fail to notice an important factor. But if their model seems convincing, the decision will still appear rational to them. Therefore, two people with the same information about the current situation may make different decisions if they use different models of the future. An error in the model becomes an error in behavior. If a model incorrectly describes causal relationships, it produces incorrect predictions. An incorrect prediction leads to a decision that may be logical within that model, but ineffective in reality. This produces the following sequence: model error, prediction error, decision error, consequences. For example, if a person believes that a particular action will inevitably lead to success, they may make a decision that would be reasonable under that assumption. The problem is not necessarily with the logic of the decision itself. The problem lies earlier, in the person's understanding of how the causal relationship between an action and its outcome actually works. Therefore, improving behavior sometimes requires more than changing the decisions themselves. It requires examining the model on which those decisions are based. Chapter 7. AI reveals the limitations of models. A generative model creates the new from accumulated patterns. A generative AI model can create images that it has never literally seen during training. It combines and transforms patterns formed from a multitude of previous examples. If a model knows what cars, roads, buildings, people, and lighting look like, it can create an image of a non-existent city by combining familiar elements into a new configuration. In this sense, generating something new does not mean creating it out of nothing. The new emerges through the recombination of already formed representations and patterns. This is an important property of any modeling system. Past experience becomes the material for constructing representations of things that have not previously existed within its direct experience. Why a model does not know what it lacks sufficient information to represent. Every model has boundaries. If its underlying information contains insufficient data about a particular phenomenon, the model does not automatically gain access to reality itself. It can construct an assumption using patterns that are similar to or familiar to it, but that assumption may turn out to be wrong. Therefore, confidence in a model should not be confused with the presence of knowledge. A model can produce a highly convincing result precisely where it lacks sufficient grounds for an accurate answer. The same applies to human thinking. A person may have a very confident understanding of an event they have never directly encountered, but confidence in one's own model does not automatically turn it into an accurate description of reality. Humans also model the unknown through the known. When a person tries to imagine the future, another person, or an unfamiliar situation, they use the knowledge and experience already available to them. We are rarely capable of constructing a representation completely independently of the past. Even when imagining something completely new, we usually combine familiar elements. Therefore, human thinking also has a certain space of possibilities shaped by previous experience. This does not mean that a person is permanently trapped within what is already known. New information, experimentation, learning, and encounters with the unexpected can expand the model. But first, new material must be acquired. This leads to an important principle. The boundaries of the current model are not the boundaries of reality. What a person cannot imagine, explain, or predict may indicate not the absence of a phenomenon, but the limitations of the model being used. Chapter 8. Reality tests the model. Prediction as a test. A model becomes testable when it can be used to make a prediction. If a model states that certain conditions lead to a particular outcome, we can wait for the outcome and compare it with the prediction. For example, if a person believes that a particular change in the environment should alter people's behavior, they can formulate the expected outcome in advance. If the prediction is repeatedly confirmed, the model gains practical support. If predictions systematically diverge from what actually happens, there is reason to reconsider the model. Therefore, the important question is not only, how convincing does this explanation sound, but also, what does this model predict? Intervention as a stronger test. Observing what happens is not enough if we want to understand causality. We may notice that two phenomena consistently occur at the same time, but this does not yet prove that one causes the other. A stronger test emerges when we change a particular condition and observe whether the expected outcome changes. In simplified form, change in condition, change in system, observable outcome. If the change occurs as predicted by the model, its causal explanation gains additional support. This is why experimentation is one of the most powerful ways to test models. We do not merely observe a system, but attempt to change it in a specific way. Feedback and model revision. The result of a test does not necessarily have to confirm the model. If reality produces a different result, this provides information about the limitations of our representation. We may discover that the model was too simple, that an important factor was not taken into account, or that the presumed causal relationship does not exist at all. Therefore, it is useful to view the process of gaining knowledge as a cycle: model, prediction, action or observation, result, comparison, model revision. The final step is crucial. A model that cannot be changed in response to new evidence becomes a dogma. A working model, by contrast, must remain open to revision. Reality does not have to conform to our model. Our model must conform to reality to the extent necessary to solve the task at hand. Chapter 9. Biological Intelligence as a Working Model of the Human. The organism, information, and internal state. A human can be viewed as a biological system that constantly receives information from the external environment and from within the organism itself. This information changes the internal state, energy levels, tension, needs, emotional state, attention, and readiness to perform certain actions. Therefore, behavior cannot be considered separately from the state of the organism. The same person may respond to the same situation in completely different ways, depending on how tired, hungry, frightened, interested, or influenced by previous experience they are. In this model, information does not simply enter the organism. It changes its state, and that state influences the subsequent processing of information and behavior. Environment, perception, state, action. The operation of this system can be represented as a simple sequence: environment, perception, state, action. The environment provides signals to the organism. The organism perceives only part of the available information and interprets it in light of previous experience. What is perceived changes the internal state. The state influences the evaluation of the situation and makes some behavioral options more likely than others. An action then takes place, which in turn changes the environment. Therefore, the more complete sequence looks like a cycle: environment, perception, state, action, new environment. This model makes it possible to look for the causes of behavior not only within the person, but also in the conditions that preceded the action. The human as part of a network of interacting systems. Humans constantly interact with other people, so behavior cannot be considered solely as an individual process. Another person becomes part of the environment. Their words and actions change our state, while our actions change their state in return. This creates a continuous chain: person, action, change in environment, another person, reaction, new environment. The same process occurs at higher levels. Families, groups, organizations, markets, governments, and information environments create conditions that influence the behavior of many people. Therefore, biological intelligence can be viewed not as an isolated object, but as an element within a network of interacting systems. This approach makes it possible to analyze behavior through the interaction between the organism and its environment, rather than searching for a single cause exclusively inside the person. Conclusion: do not believe in the model. Use it. Every model has limits. Every model is a simplification of reality. It highlights certain properties and relationships considered important for a particular task, but inevitably leaves many other factors outside the scope of consideration. Therefore, even a model that works well should not be perceived as a complete description of the world. It is important to remember, a model is a tool, not reality itself. A model may be useful in one context and insufficient in another. Its boundaries are determined by how well it continues to work when conditions change. A good model enables better predictions. The value of a model is not limited to its ability to explain what has already happened. A more important property is its ability to be used to make predictions. If a model makes it possible to understand what consequences a particular action is likely to produce, it becomes a practical tool. Therefore, a good model should help answer not only the question, why did this happen, but also, what will happen if the conditions change? The more accurately a model allows us to predict outcomes, and the more consistently those outcomes can be reproduced, the greater its practical value. The best model is the one that reality allows us to test continuously. A model should not become an object of belief. It must be constantly compared with observable results. Model, prediction, action, result, feedback, model revision. If the results confirm the predictions, the model continues to work. If they do not, we need to identify the error, refine the model, or replace it with another. Therefore, a person does not have to discover a final picture of the world once and for all. The task is much more practical: to build sufficiently good models, test them against reality, and remain willing to abandon them when they stop working. The best model is not the one that cannot be disproved. The best model is the one that allows us to understand what is happening more accurately, predict consequences more effectively, and interact with reality more efficiently. And when a model appears that does this better, it should be replaced.